Okay, so we are covering completing the square and solving quadratics by completing the square. So I have the quadratic x squared plus 4x minus 12 equals 0. So to solve by completing the square, your first step is anything without an x needs to be moved over to the right side of the equation. So I'm going to add 12 to each side. Oh, goodness. Go back. Add 12 to each side. So I have x squared plus 4x equals 12. Next, if a was anything other than 1, I would have to divide everything by a. Fortunately, a is 1 here, so I don't have to worry about that. So now I'm going to set up some parentheses, and I'm going to do this every single time. So I'm going to do a parenthesis, x, leave some space, close it, squared, equals whatever's on the right side, which is 12. Now I'm going to go to where x is. So this is a 4x. My b is 4. And I'm going to half b. So it's going to be plus 2. I take half of b, and that's what goes in the parentheses. Now that number that I just took half of, I'm going to square that and add it to the other side. So 2 squared is 4, so I'm going to add 4 to the right side. So now I have x plus 2 squared equals 16. Okay, now I can go through and solve for x. So my first step is I'm going to square root both sides. So I have x plus 2 equals plus or minus, because when you take the square root, it's always plus or minus. And then the square root of 16 is 4. So the square root of 16 is positive 4 and negative 4. And now my last step is to get x alone. I'm going to subtract 2 from each side. So I get that x equals, I've got positive 4 minus 2, which is 2. And I've got negative 4 minus 2, which is negative 6. So I have two solutions here. And my two solutions are 2 and negative 6. So the process here, get anything with an x on the left side, anything without an x on the right side. Then you set up your parentheses and you take half of b and that goes in the parentheses. Then you square that number, add it to the other side, and then you solve by square rooting. This next example, I have x squared plus 6x plus 8 equals 0. So my first step is I'm going to get the x's alone, so I'm going to subtract 8. So I have x squared plus 6x equals negative 8. Now I'm going to set up my parentheses. So I have x, leave some space, close it, squared equals negative 8. And then what goes in the parentheses is half of b. So b is 6, so half of that is positive 3. And now you're going to square that. So 3 squared is 9, and we're adding that to the other side. So now I have x plus 3 squared equals 1. So now I'm going to square root both sides. And when I square root the left side, I end up with x plus 3. But when I square root the right side, the square root of 1 is a positive and a negative 1. And then my last step is I subtract 3. So I get that x equals positive 1 minus 3, which is negative 2, and negative 1 minus 3, which is negative 4. So our two solutions are negative 2 and negative 4. Okay, I have 3x squared minus 2x minus 1 equals 0. So first we have to get anything with an x on one side, anything without it on the other side. So I have 3x squared minus 2x equals 1. Now this one's a little different because our a is not 1. So when that happens, you have got to divide everything by a. So we're going to divide everything here by 3. So I get x squared minus 2/3 x equals 1/3. Now we can set up our parentheses. So parenthesis x, leave some space, close it, squared equals 1/3. And now for what goes in the parentheses is you take half of b. So half of negative 2/3 is going to be, let's see here, negative 1/3. And now you're going to square that and add it to the other side. So 1/3 squared is 1/9. So now we have x minus 1/3 squared equals, to add these together, I've got to get a common denominator, so make this 3/9. So equals 4/9. Okay, and now I'm going to solve by square rooting. So I'm going to square root each side. So I get x minus 1/3 equals plus or minus, when you square root a fraction, you square root the top and square root the bottom. So that's 2/3. And then add 1/3 to each side. So I get that x equals, I've got 2/3 plus 1/3, so that's 1, and negative 2/3 plus 1/3, so negative 1/3. So my two solutions are 1 and negative 1/3. So here I've got another one. I've got 2x squared plus 11x plus 15 equals 0. So I need to subtract 15 from each side. Oh, goodness. Did not mean to do that. Okay, so I'm subtracting 15 from each side. So I get 2x squared plus 11x equals negative 15. Now, a is 2, which means I have to divide everything by 2. So x squared plus 11 halves x equals negative 15 halves. And now I have to set up my parentheses. So parenthesis x, leave some space, close it, squared equals negative 15 halves. Okay, and now we take half of b. So b is 11 halves, which means half of that is 11/4. And then we square it and add it to the other side. So when I square 11, I get 121. Over squaring 4, I get 16. And then to add together, I need to get a common denominator. So for 2 and 16, my common denominator is 16. So I'm multiplying 15 halves, top and bottom, by 8. So I get x plus 11/4 squared equals, let's see, 15 times 8, that is 120. So positive 1 over 16. And now this doesn't look like a 4, that looks like a y. Okay, so then now to solve by square root, I'm going to take the square root of each side. So I get x plus 11/4 equals plus or minus the square root of 1 over the square root of 16 is 1/4. And now we can subtract 11/4 from each side. So x equals, I've got positive 1/4 minus 11/4, so that's negative 10/4, which is really negative 5 halves. And I have negative 1/4 minus 11/4, which is negative 12/4, which is negative 3. So my two solutions are negative 3 and negative 5 halves. Okay. All right, I have x squared plus 4x plus 11 equals 0. So let's move 11 over. So I have x squared plus 4x equals negative 11. And now I can set up my parentheses since a is 1. So parenthesis x, leave some space, close it, squared equals negative 11. And now for what goes in my parentheses is I take half of b. So b is 4, so half of that is 2. And then I'm going to square that and add that to the other side. So 2 squared is 4, and I'll add it over here. So I have x plus 2 squared equals negative 7. And now to solve, I'm going to square root both sides. So I get x plus 2 equals plus or minus the square root of negative 7. Now, we've talked about square roots of negatives. We can't take square roots of negatives without it being a complex number. So we're going to have to change the square root of negative 7 to be an imaginary number. So that's x plus 2 equals plus or minus the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 7, which means I have x plus 2 equals plus or minus I radical 7. And now I need to just subtract 2 from each side. So I get that x equals negative 2 plus or minus I radical 7. The I always goes in front of the radical, but your radical needs to come at the very, very, very end. So that's why I set it up like this. So your radical needs to be the very, very last thing in your problem. Okay, so one more of these with the imaginary numbers. I've got x squared plus 4x plus 5 equals 0. So I can move 5 over. So I get x squared plus 4x equals negative 5. I don't have to divide by anything since a is 1, so I can set up my parentheses. So parenthesis x, leave some space, close it, squared equals negative 5. And now I'm going to go to b, which is 4, and take half of that, so that's 2. And then you're going to square that and add that to the other side, so 2 squared is 4. Now add it there. So I have x plus 2 squared equals negative 1. And now to finish solving, I'm going to square root both sides. So I get that x plus 2 equals, the square root of negative 1 is plus or minus I. And now subtract 2. And we always put I at the end, so x equals negative 2 plus or minus I. So it's negative 2 plus I and negative 2 minus I. So it's going to be answer choice D. And that is it for solving by completing the square.